as a graduate student, I started graduate school 53 years ago. And I was actually working at Oregon State in oceanography. So we were working offshore in the deep ocean. And at that point, I guess every graduate student is trying to figure out what they're going to do. And I was doing collecting sediment cores from the deep sea. You know, we drop a core off a ship. We were in about 12 or 13,000 feet of water. And what you bring back are these long tubes full of mud. But the ocean floor is this wonderful history book. Because as anything happens in the surface water, whether it's organisms that live and die, or sediment, or volcanic eruptions, or as water temperature changes, all those are reflected in what collects on the seafloor. So what we were doing was collecting these cores, and as I started looking at those, there were some repeated changes, and they tended to correspond with climate changes. It turns out, at least in the Pacific Northwest, the Eastern Pacific, when the water's warm, a certain type of organism dominated the plankton. They were radiolaria. They're little tiny animals that make shells out of silica, and they live and die, and many of them sink to the seafloor and build up in the sediment. And then when the water gets colder, it turns out they're replaced by another kind of animal called a planktonic foraminifera, just what you always wanted to know. And their shells look very different. They're calcium carbonate, like oysters and coral reefs, and they look like little golf balls stuck together. So if you take a sample of sediment and wash it and put it through a screen and then under a microscope, you can see the abundance of these two types, and pretty soon it went from all warm water to all cold water, back to all warm water. So I realized we were seeing glacier, interglacial, or warm and cool. So I was working on climate change a little over 50 years ago. We weren't worried about sea level rise then, not like today where we think about all the things that are happening. So as I came to Santa Cruz, I started working on other things, but because I had a degree in oceanography and an undergraduate degree in geology and also a minor in civil engineering, all that started to come together in the coastal zone because it's where waves hit the land, and we have engineering with seawalls and harbors and so forth. So I started working on initially coastal hazards, what happens when climates, you know, when we have El Niños, when we have storms, when we have tsunamis. And ultimately that led to sort of a more focused, and in the last, I guess, 15 or 20 or so years has been much more climate change related. And that's really, as we become more aware of climate and sea level, it's become sort of central to what I do. I don't know, that gives you a little bit of sense of sort of how I came to do. But I worked on geologic hazards for a long time, everything from, well, when I came to Santa Cruz, we started what I've called sort of decades of disasters. So the climate was sort of calm from the mid-1940s to about late 1970s. We were in what we call a calm Pacific decadal oscillation cycle. We met fewer El Nino events, not as many storms. It was also a period characterized offshore by sardines. And that's when Cannery Row sort of had its peak from the actually, it peaked in the 30s, 40s, and then came to a close. And then it was a warm, stormier cycle. Then we went into this calm period. And in 78, it shifted back to, again, a period of sardines, storms, El Niños, and I began to see what was happening along the coast. So I started focusing on that, and then we had the 78 El Nino, and wow, houses were being flooded, and cliffs were collapsing, and then we had a big 83 El Nino, then the 97, 98 El Nino. So it was sort of the climate being superimposed on the coastline, which got me more involved. So that's sort of a short history of, you know, moving from the deep sea up into the coastline.